Hello there. I'm just going to push you back up a little. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for joining me. Before I kick off properly, I want to talk a little bit about what it is that I do and the type of creative work I do more specifically. So I've previously worked at both Distilled and Verve Search on teams that have collectively secured over 22,000 pieces of linked coverage. These are some of the places where we've got coverage for our clients. So I also want to talk a little bit about the sort of content we create. The way I describe it is it's content that journalists want to write about and people want to share. So I just want to show you a few examples. So this was a piece called The View from Here, and we created it in collaboration with people from 27 countries all over the world. We asked them to take a photo from their window in the morning and again in the evening, and created a piece with all of their photos. The second piece I want to show you is called Demolishing Modernism. It was created for a UK client, and it's a series of illustrations of the modernist architecture we've lost to the wrecking ball. And then the final example I want to show you, this is called What Would You Tell Your Teenage Self? And it's what some of today's most successful people would tell their younger selves. So the advice they could dispense to themselves were they able to travel back in time. So today I am a creative content consultant. I set up on my own about just over a year ago. You can find out more about me at worderist.com. So since going out on my own last year, creative block is something that I've been asked about a lot, hence the talk today. So first up, I think it's useful to just define what I think creative block is. I think it's this: when you have no ideas and no idea what to do next, you're stuck. But what's the opposite of creative block? If we know what we don't want, what is it that we want? Well, I think the opposite of creative block is flow, when you're in flow. So what is flow? Well, I think it's this. It's kind of tough to describe, but I'm gonna roll with this one. So it's when you know what to do and you know how to do it and you know that you're doing it well. It's when you're fully immersed and you're enjoying what you're doing. I think ultimately, you know you're in flow when work feels like play, and if ideation is what you're doing, coming up with creative concepts, ideas come easily to you. So whilst being in flow might feel like you're not working, or it doesn't really feel like hard work, actually you're working really hard and really effectively. So how do we get from creative block to flow? So how do we get from having no ideas and no idea what to do next to flow, so to where work feels like play and ideas come easily? Well, here's the thing. We often talk about creative block as if it's a specific, singular, concrete problem. But actually, I think the truth is that creative block is a catch-all term for a whole bunch of very different problems. Now, the net result of all of those problems is the same, right? You feel hopelessly stuck and you're not sure what to do next. But I think if you want to unstick yourself and get into flow, you actually need to figure out what sort of creative block it is that you're suffering from. And that's really the essence of today's talk. I've identified 5 common types of creative block, and I'm going to talk about each one in turn. Okay. So first up, do you know what to do? Well, without a clear goal, it can be tough to figure out where to begin. And I often hear stuff like this: constraints fuel creativity. And I think that's sort of true, but it's not really the full story. I think actually what fuels creativity is striking a balance between freedom and constraint. So too many constraints limit possibilities and you have no space to play. So it's very, very difficult to be creative in a very constrained space. However, too much freedom makes it hard to figure out where to start. So that can also be problematic. So we need to strike a balance, but what does that look like? I think in some instances, creative block can be quite useful. So for example, if you're working on a project, you might have a lot of ideas, but you don't know where to start. So the creative brief actually is the problem here. So a brief with too many constraints can definitely cause problems. So for example, if I was given a creative brief like this, excuse me, come up with creative ideas about motorized window blinds. Now, it might be possible. It might be possible for me to come up with an idea about motorized window blinds that journalists would want to write about and people would want to share. But I think it's an incredibly restrictive brief, and it's unlikely to yield good creative work. Conversely, however, the absence of a brief or an overly open brief can cause creative blocks. I hear this a lot, and I've certainly heard this a lot historically. This client's open to anything, you have complete creative freedom. And something inside me dies when I hear that, because it's very difficult to come up with workable ideas about just anything, one. And two, it's never the truth. Like, you never have complete creative freedom. All that's happening there really is the client has a load of constraints that they're just assuming you know about, or assuming that you're going to observe. Of course, if you don't know about them, you can't. So, what should a creative brief contain? Well, as a minimum, I think you need the following. I like to ask for 5 to 10 sites where the client or company want coverage. The reason I ask for 5 to 10 sites is if they give me 5 or 10, from that I can extrapolate a much larger list, and it gives me a good sense of really what they're shooting for. Where do they want coverage? Where do they want this content placed? The other thing I think you need is a list of topics that they absolutely won't entertain. This is really just so that you don't waste a lot of time on something which you're unlikely to be able to produce. There's some other stuff that's nice to have, if you can get it. So topics that the client's keen to explore. This is lovely when it works. It's tricky when it doesn't. So this bit often goes awry, because instead of topics, what you frequently see are product or service offerings listed. So they aren't really topics around content or topics that people necessarily care about, their products. It's always lovely to know a little bit about which customers these clients are seeking to attract. So where do these customers hang out online? What are their specific interests? Now, again, this can go a little bit awry for companies who target very, very broad audience subsets, because it's hard to get detail, but if you can, it's really, really great. The other thing I love to be able to get my hands on is some examples of content that they wish they'd made. When I can get my hands on that, it gives me a really clear idea of what this client aspires to, what sort of content really excites them and they would really, really like to see. So, creative briefs can definitely cause blocks, but sometimes the block is actually in your head. And this really I'm kind of categorizing as mindset problems. And again, I'm going to talk you through a few examples. I think sometimes we have a tendency to see limits which aren't really there. In the past, I've been asked to come up with creative ideas for a company that sells contact lenses, for a VPN provider, for a mattress review company. And on dark days, when I see any limits, this is actually what I hear. Come up with creative ideas about contact lenses, or about VPNs, or about mattress reviews. Now, that's not actually what I've been asked to do. And actually thinking like that causes me to set my own limits, which actually aren't really there. So what I want to do is, for each of these examples, show you kind of how I approach broadening out these sorts of briefs. So come up with creative ideas for a company that sells contact lenses. These sorts of mind maps, I tend to do using pen and paper, and I do them very quickly and they're quite scribbly. This is obviously a neatened up version. But here's one example. So sometimes it can be really helpful to think bigger. So in this instance, I went from contact lenses to sight to optics. And then when I started thinking about optics, I was thinking about optical illusions, spot the hidden object puzzles. Seeing Jesus on a slice of toast is a phenomena called pareidolia, which is super interesting. Things like change blindness, color blindness, those kinds of things. Much more breadth, much more scope there than thinking purely about contact lenses, right? In the other direction, I've gone to vision, and actually this is probably about as big as you can get. How do people see the world? What is their world view? So this really broadens things out and gives me much more space to play. I want to talk to you about another example, creative ideas for a VPN provider. So sometimes, rather than thinking about the product or service itself, thinking about why people use it can be really, really useful. So here, for the VPN provider, I started out thinking about, why do people use VPNs? And there are a range of reasons: privacy, data security, censorship. People use VPNs to be able to access content that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access in their country. Just to access content, right? TV, music, gaming, that kind of thing, to get the best deals, money saving. There are lots of reasons that people use VPNs. And actually, these topics are far more interesting, I would argue, and far more likely to enable you to come up with good creative ideas if you're thinking about these things rather than thinking purely about VPNs. Final example, come up with creative ideas for a mattress review company. So here, what I've been thinking about is connections to the product or service. So I've gone from mattress to bed to sleep. And sleep is a really, really interesting topic because we can talk about sleep conditions, sleep problems, what actually happens to you physically and mentally if you don't get enough sleep. We can talk about dreams and nightmares, and we can talk about familial relationships, so babies, children, and parents, and how their relationships change because of sleep, right? What else happens in bed? Well, sex happens in bed. And so if we can talk about sex, we can talk about relationships. We can also talk about things that may kind of crop up. So like arguments about snoring or whether or not you should actually allow a pet on the bed, for example. We've also got topics like hygiene. So we can talk about bed bugs and allergies and that kind of thing. Kind of gross, but, potentially interesting. Not really to me. I'd rather not think about it, but there you go. So, conversely, though, so I've talked about how to kind of expand out a topic, but what about when you need to narrow down, right? So sometimes the problem for me is not that I'm seeing limits. The problem is that I have too much freedom. So some of my clients have been open to creating content around a huge array of topics. I feel like travel clients in particular are often very open. So I've had travel clients in the past that are cool with creating content around history and culture and language and sport and food and drink and books and movies and TV, and the list is endless, right? And sometimes I find myself flitting from one topic to another, to another, to another, but not actually getting any concrete ideas down. And I think what's happening here is that the range of possibilities actually cause me to lack focus. So when I find myself in a space like this, and I think it's important to recognize what kind of a space you're in order to be able to act appropriately. When I recognize I'm kind of in a space like this, so I'm unfocused and everything's just a bit all over the place, I set my own constraints. So what I like to do is focus on just one topic area. I'll set a timer on my phone for say 15 minutes. And if I find myself thinking about another topic or another idea, I'll jot down a quick note, but I won't allow myself to disappear down an unrelated rabbit hole of another idea during that time period. So I'm kind of forcing constraint on myself. So I'm just thinking about ideas about movies, for example, or about music, or about books. So just to kind of wrap this section up, I feel strongly constraints do not fuel creativity, but neither does unlimited freedom. What fuels creativity is striking a balance between freedom and constraint. This is a great quote from Trey Spiegel. He's a mixed media artist. He says, you have to set up the narrow parameters that you work in, and then within those, give yourself just enough room to be free and play. So some of this stuff can be solved for with a balanced brief, as I highlighted at the beginning. Sometimes the problem might be the creative brief. Some of the stuff you just have to solve for yourself by altering either your mindset or your approach. So let's move on to the second part. Do you know how to do what you're trying to do? There are a bunch of myths about creativity. Many people believe that ideas just come to you, like it's some sort of magic, basically. And actually, that's not the case. Creativity is not the ability to conjure ideas out of thin air. It's part process and part practice. I think it's really important to figure out a creative process that works for you, and then continue to practice and refine that process over time. Now, I can't tell you what will work for you, but I can share what works for me right now. What I will say, like the caveat I'll add on that, is that through practice, my process has evolved. I fully expect it to evolve again in the future. It's not necessarily set in stone, right? For me, ideation is a three-stage process: inspiration, generation, and validation. So in terms of inspiration, really what I'm looking for here is like, what's out there? What's already being created? What's already being talked about? What excites me personally? What sparks my curiosity? So often, obviously, you need to be fairly concrete about this. So I tend to approach this as either being specific to a particular client or company sector. So I will look to see what are journalists writing about in this space. And I'll try and think about why they're writing that stuff. What seems to be shared a lot? Why is that being shared? What's resonating with people? What are competitors doing? Sometimes it can be really interesting to have a look and see what competitors in the space are doing and what seems to be working for them. The other thing that I will look for are data sources. So what's publicly available? What kind of data might I be able to get my hands on pertaining to this particular topic? People always ask me about the tools I use. So just very, very briefly, these are the tools I use. I use BuzzSumo. It's a terrific tool. It allows you to find the most shared content, so the most socially shared content. You can search by topic. So for example, you could search for, say, finance or money, and it will pull back all of the most shared articles in that sort of finance space across a huge range of publications. The other thing you can do is look by specific publication. So you can look to see what is the most shared content on Forbes, for example. You can look to see what the most shared content within a particular section of Forbes is. So you can just look at, like, for example, a finance section or a business section. And the other thing you can do is look at a publication and a topic area. So you could look at Forbes and finance, for example. That's super, super useful. It is a paid-for tool, but I feel like it's definitely worth it. One thing I will say is Ahrefs also have a similar tool. It's called Content Explorer. I haven't used it, but I know a lot of people who have, who seem to love it. So you can also use that, maybe if that's something that you already have access to. Other stuff I like to use, Pinterest. I search on Pinterest. Pinterest can be an absolute treasure trove of kind of interesting visual content. So that can be really, really cool, searching for particular topic areas on Pinterest. Also, you know, Google is your friend. Google image search, Google News, all of those really, really useful. Another thing I do is I've created and maintain my own swipe file. So I use Pinterest for this. And my swipe file really just contains examples of content that I really like, that I find interesting. So sometimes it's the topic that I find interesting. Sometimes it's the visual that's been created, which I really, really like. So it's actually a format thing that I'm collating here. It's really, really useful to be able to go back to, kind of, if ever I'm feeling lost or I'm feeling stuck, I'll pull up my swipe file and have a look at that. So that was inspiration. The next thing I want to talk about is generation. Excuse me, or making connections. So, generating ideas. Again, we're thinking specific to the client or company sector. What can we do? What can we create which will feed into what journalists are already writing about? What could we do around the most resonant topics? Is there something a competitor has done which we could do better or do differently? Is there anything we could do with a public data source? Is there a way that we could get data that isn't readily available, right now? And then broader stuff, right? Is there a topic which resonates with me, which I could explore within this space? Is there something that's been created in a totally unrelated field, which I feel like I could apply here? Those are the sorts of things I'm thinking about. And then finally, validation, right? This is the final stage. So in terms of validation, I'm thinking about a specific single idea. Is this possible? Has this been done before? What's new or different about what I'm creating or I'm proposing we create? What evidence do I have that this will resonate? How confident do I feel that this is actually going to work and actually going to gain coverage? Is this right for the client or company? Is that on brief? Those are the kind of things I think about. Now, the way I've described that process, it sounds very linear, right? It sounds like I'm saying you do inspiration, you do generation, then you do validation. But actually, that's not how I work a lot of the time. Sometimes I jump quickly back and forth between inspiration and generation. Sometimes I'll jump from inspiration to generation to validation for a single idea. Other times I'll just seek inspiration and leave generation for another day. Sometimes I'll generate 20 ideas before I validate anything. Sometimes the process of generation will lead me back to seek further inspiration. And sometimes when I'm validating one idea, it'll spark a totally new one. I find that I need to let myself play in each of these spaces in whatever capacity seems to be working for me that day. I can jump around however I want, but I still need to be mindful of potential blocks. So blocks for me here might look like this. So too much inspiration, I get overwhelmed, unfocused, and ultimately blocked. Like I'm not able to really focus on anything. Generation without inspiration often leads to a block because there's not enough there for me to make connections. And then finally, validation when I'm in the wrong mindset can lead to blocks because I reject all of my ideas. So having a process won't solve all of your problems, but I do think it helps. And in my experience, following a process yields more reliable results than sitting around trying to conjure ideas out of thin air. So, part 3. Do you think that you're bad at this? In this industry, we share our most successful content pieces. The trouble is, because we share only our successful content, I think we're inadvertently presenting a skewed version of reality. You only see other people's good ideas. Their bad ideas are invisible to you, partly because they're not shared, but mainly because they don't get coverage, you don't see them. So you never see when other people fail. And I think as a result, I hear stuff like this a lot. People tell me that when they compare their work to that of others, they feel like they're coming up short, that other people are better at this than they are. I think it's really important to remember that you are not comparing yourself or your work to reality. You're comparing your whole body of work, so all of the successes and all of the failures, to only the most successful work of others. Now, I'm guilty of this too, right? At the very beginning of this presentation, I shared some successful content I've created in the past, but it's worth noting that those pieces that I shared are outliers, and the pieces that I've shared in past presentations are also outliers. The stuff I share probably represents less than 10% of the work that I've done. I talk more about this skewed version of reality here on my own site. If you're interested, please do check it out. So, we have this issue, right? If you find yourself in a place like this, what do you do? What can you practically do? First step, build yourself up. Remind yourself of successful work that you've done before. We have a tendency to remember failure and forget success, so remind yourself. Then, spend 5 minutes coming up with the worst ideas you possibly can. I feel like you should do this because it's fun. It like relieves the pressure a bit, but also sometimes you can flip a terrible idea into a good one. Other things to try. Do a creative exercise. These are 3 books that I own and I heartily recommend. I'm a massive proponent of creative exercises. I think they can be incredibly useful. However, I think that they're useful perhaps in a slightly different way to how people imagine. So I think a lot of people think that you can use a bunch of creative exercises to quickly generate an awful lot of really, really great ideas. And I think the truth is, honestly, that's normally not the case. Creative exercises don't necessarily yield great ideas directly. What they're really good for, though, is getting you back in flow, getting you back in a good space where you're able to be free and play. And I think that's where they're really, really powerful. Number 5, are you being constantly interrupted? Constant interruptions break your flow. When you're interrupted, it takes an average of 23 minutes to get back to the task. This was according to a study done by the University of California. Now, I really feel strongly that this is important, right? Don't allow yourself to be interrupted. Don't interrupt yourself. When you're doing either creative work or any work that really requires your full focus, close your email, close your social media accounts, close Slack or whatever poisonous communication or project management tool you use. Disable all notifications, put your phone on flight mode. Put your phone on flight mode and take it out of the room so you can't see it. There's been studies that suggest even just having your phone near you distracts you, which is pretty terrifying, isn't it? If you work somewhere where you're constantly interrupted, leave that space. I'm not suggesting you quit your job, but go and work somewhere where you won't be interrupted. So that might be a cafe, a library, it might be from home. Equally, if you're interrupted at home, don't work there, right? Anywhere where you can limit those interruptions. I think you'll be really surprised at the amount of good work you can get done with 1 interrupted hour. And particularly when you compare and contrast that to 3 hours of work where you've been consistently interrupted. Final piece of the puzzle. You're not enjoying what you're doing. Now, this is a really tough one to unpick. Here are some things that I've struggled with and some of the things that I've kind of done to try and help solve these problems. So, number 1. Are you working in a way that doesn't work for you? What I'm talking about here is time. Do you know how long it takes you to come up with a set of ideas? You really do need to know. If you don't know, you can't schedule your time effectively. So use Toggle or similar. Toggle is a free time tracking tool. There are tons out there. Use Toggle or similar to track your time over several rounds of ideation. Figure out how long it typically takes you. Over time, I figured out it takes me around about 17 hours on each round of ideation. In 17 hours, I can come up with around about 4 to 6 workable ideas. Sometimes I'm faster, sometimes I'm slower. But if I give myself less than 17 hours, my output is never as good. So that might mean fewer ideas, or it might mean lower quality ideas, but either way, not as good. The other thing I've noticed is that when I do the work seems to be important. I do my best work between 6 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. So if I'm coming up with a set of ideas, I try to schedule that work over 5 days between 6 a.m. and 9:30. Next thing I want to talk about is space. Your brain is amazing. It goes on working without you realizing it. You might actually have experienced this yourself. An idea that seemingly comes to you out of nowhere. Maybe you're in the shower or out for a walk or cooking dinner. You weren't actually trying to come up with an idea. You weren't even consciously thinking about it. It just appeared. I think you can game the system a little. When I do creative work like ideation in small bursts over 5 days, I have way more instances when ideas just appear, when good ideas seemingly just appear. However, if I concentrate those 17 hours of work over just 2 days, most of the time, none of those ideas just appear. And I suspect it's because I'm not giving myself enough space. So try changing up your routine a little. See if more ideas just appear when you do creative work in small, short bursts, rather than trying to like smash through 2 whole days. Other things to think about: solo versus team working. I don't actually play nicely with others, I'm embarrassed to admit. I'm a solitary person. I do my best work alone. Now, that's not true for everyone. Some people work best in a team. To come up with ideas, they actually need other people to bounce off. I'm not one of those people, but lots of people are. I think it's really important to figure out not just when you do your best work, but how. Possibly you'll work best with a combination. So for example, you're best doing inspiration on your own, but generation with others. Or possibly actually for you, it'll be like inspiration and generation on your own, but validation with others. Again, I think it's really important to figure this stuff out so you can schedule your work appropriately. But maybe that isn't the problem, right? Is pressure the problem? How do you handle pressure? Coming up with creative ideas in a commercial environment is high pressure. There are deadlines, people are relying on you to deliver. Your job or other people's jobs might actually be on the line. and that's a really heavy load to carry. Increasingly, I'm of the belief that my best work happens when I'm playing. For me, flow is not so much about work feeling like play. Flow happens only when I'm able to play. So when I'm relaxed and open and curious. But of course, it's very difficult for me to feel relaxed, open, or curious when I feel under pressure. I'm one of the sorts of people who find deadlines paralyzing, actually. So as I approach a deadline, this often happens. I have no ideas, no idea what to do next, and no time to do anything. It's a horrible feeling. And my mind sort of gets stuck in this interminable loop of there's no time, there's no time, there's no time, there's no time. Of course, if I'm not able to think clearly and play is the furthest thing from my mind, I'm going to remain stuck in this mindset. And it's extremely unlikely that I'll come up with anything workable. So this mindset is actually preventing me from doing good work. As such, I try and flip my mindset. So here's some things which I do, might help you if you suffer similarly. First of all, sit with the feeling. Someone told me once that a feeling lasts for a maximum of 1 minute, unless you feed it. So stuff like this interminable loop of telling yourself there's no time, there's no time, there's no time, actually feeds the negative feeling and causes it to grow. If you take a minute just to sit with the feeling and don't feed it, just accept it, just be like, I feel under pressure, but that's okay. Don't feed it. You may find it will quickly pass. Other things you can do, write it out. Give yourself 2 minutes to write down all of the things that will happen if you don't deliver those ideas. Now read those things back. If you've gone really hard on this exercise and imagined the apocalypse, ask yourself, is that what's really going to happen? Probably not. If your list is less than apocalyptic, hopefully it will give you some perspective. Just a gentle reminder, we are not working in a life or death environment. It might feel like it sometimes, but it's really not the case. Other option is just to go outside. Get away from your desk and go outside for 10 minutes. Now, this may feel counterintuitive, right? You know, I'm saying to you, you've got no ideas, you don't know what to do next, and you've got no time. And I'm suggesting you walk away and stop doing work. But the truth is you're not doing any useful work anyway. Get outside, go outside for 10 minutes. Sometimes I find just getting up and moving is enough to shake off a negative mindset like this. Once you've done one or more of these things, force yourself to play. So force yourself to get back in flow. I find a completely unrelated creative exercise often works better. I'm just going to shoot back to these books again. I find, for me, doing a creative exercise, spending 5 minutes on just an unrelated creative exercise frequently gets me back in the right mind space. So, final thing I want to talk about. Are you feeling a more general sense of discontent? Is the work just not satisfying you in the way that you thought it would? I can definitely relate. I think the solution here that I would recommend for you is to consider making things just for you. It took me a long time to realize that I needed to make things for myself, that having a creative job was not enough. Because whilst client work is often fulfilling, there are frequently compromises that have to be made. And the truth is that it's rarely the case that I get to make whatever it is that I want to make. So now I make stuff just for me. The stuff is deliberately not a side hustle. It's stuff that I'm extremely unlikely to be able to monetize effectively. And that's the point. It's an outlet that exists only for me. I'd strongly encourage you to consider whether or not this is something you need to try out too. So it's almost time to wrap this thing up. Next time you're feeling blocked, ask yourself is one or more of these things the problem? So first up, try and identify what it is that you feel is blocking you. Do you know what to do? Is the problem with the creative brief, or is it with an internal block? Have you got an internal block, something in your head as opposed to something external? Remember, constraints don't fuel creativity, but neither does unbounded freedom. We need balance. Do you know how to do what you're doing? Have you invested sufficient time in your own creative process? Creativity is not the ability to conjure ideas out of thin air. It's process and practice. Work on both. Do you think that you're bad at this? Please remember that other people's bad ideas are invisible, and you're not comparing yourself or your work to reality. You only see other people's good ideas. I promise you, you are not bad at this. You are not. If you're constantly being interrupted or interrupting yourself, stop. Shut down all interruptions. Remember, when you're interrupted, it takes an average of 23 minutes to get back on track. You will be amazed at the amount of good work you can do with one solid interrupted hour versus 3 hours of interrupted work. So do close down those interruptions, focus. Give yourself a chance to focus. And finally, are you not enjoying what you're doing? I'm increasingly of the belief that to do good creative work, you need to be in a good place. So think about, is it that you're trying to work in a way that doesn't work for you? Is this about time? Is it about space? Is it about solo versus teamwork? Is pressure the problem? Are you struggling under the pressure? Is how you're handling the pressure part of the problem? Or is your work just not satisfying you in the way that you thought it would? Final thoughts from me. I'm definitely not at the point where I'm consistently in flow. I have days when work feels like play and ideas come easily, but I also have days when creative work feels like pushing water up a hill. It can feel like an endless soul-crushing grind. And even though I know what I need to do to get in flow, I can't always get there. Nevertheless, I think that something good is happening, even on bad days, because it's often the case that the following day, when I review what I've done, I can see tons of possibilities. And a good day, where work feels like play and ideas come easily, often follows a bad one. I wish you all the luck in the world. Here are my details. I'll happily take some questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was wonderful. As a personal opinion, it's a field of digital marketing where we talk about emotions very much.
Yeah.
You use a lot of words like mindset, pressure, and stress, and it requires a kind of mindset and self-awareness to get through all the obstacles, I think.
Definitely. I definitely concur. Yeah.
Yeah, and you shared a lot of useful tips. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And there are comments. They are really thankful for your presentation. Actually, there's one question. I would like to read it for you. Okay. And from Işınsu Unaran. Thank you for this very helpful presentation, Hannah. I have a question. At a time when there's a content being created and published every single minute, how can we maintain originality and how can we stand out?
So it's a great question. I'm a strong proponent of doing less, not more. So I think, the fact that there's, for most brands, most companies, you're not going to be able to compete on volume. So there are publishers out there who have teams of writers who are creating content literally every minute of the day because they have they have a 24-hour shift pattern. So there are people who work days and people who work nights. So you're never going to be able to compete on quantity. And I really don't think that you need to. The sorts of content that I kind of work on with clients, obviously it depends on the client and it depends on their budget and the size of the company. But most of the clients I work for, like, will launch a piece of content at a rate of maybe like 1 a month, 2 a month. And I think that actually that's really where your time is better spent, like creating one piece of content which is incredibly resonant and incredibly interesting to your target audience, most of the time will yield you far more high quality coverage than trying to do 10 things in the same time frame. So yeah, so I wouldn't worry too much about focusing on quantity. I would definitely focus on quality instead.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much. And one last question from Peter Bingham. 17 hours for ideation is way more than we get on average, as many of our clients are on a budget. 4 hours is about what we get. Any tips for getting the most out of those 4 hours? Yeah,
I mean, so if I only had 4 hours, I would be super strict about how those 4 hours were used. So, and it happens, like, I completely understand, you know, not everybody has a huge budget, right? So yeah, if I only had 4 hours, I would split it into 4 single chunks. So I would do a 1 hour burst, and then the following day, another 1 hour burst, the following day, another 1 hour burst, and the final day, another 1 hour burst. So that really you're kind of trying to make the most of the time that you do have. If you had 4 hours, then that's an afternoon, right? If you just spent that on a single afternoon, I suspect probably you wouldn't get so much high quality out. Definitely I'd shut down all the interruptions during that time. Nobody, I would definitely kind of box off that time completely. I would also kind of talk to the client a bit. I sort of feel like when you've got very, very limited time on ideation, the creative brief is even more important. So kind of before I even started, I would want a really clear brief from the client. So the things I would be particularly interested in is like, which topics are off the table, right? And you know, like, sometimes you can guess, but sometimes you'll guess wrong, right? So for a lot of clients, politics is off the table. They don't want to do anything political. But that's not true for all clients. For some clients, things like sex are off the table. Like, they're not going to do any content about sex, or not do any content about relationships. And definitely, I think when you're under time pressure like that, you really need to know that stuff, because you could waste a whole hour, 25% of your time, thinking about ideas around a particular topic that the client is never going to sign off. So that's sort of how I would approach that. But yeah, these things are tough for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if we have time, we have one more question. Yeah, from Arej Abu Ali. I get overwhelmed by different frameworks to use to get into my creative flow. What's the one thing that constantly works in keeping you productive?
Oh yeah, like, it's a great question. Is there a consistent thing in terms of framework that helps me stay productive? I think probably the time that has been most usefully spent, kind of like when I look back, like what keeps me most productive. I think there are sort of 3 things that I've done over time. The swipe file, which I mentioned at the beginning. So having a collection of content, which I think is brilliant and I love, and I can refer back to. is invaluable. And obviously I've spent years kind of curating that. But having, like, being without it, like if you were to say to me, like, I'm taking that away from you, I'd be like, oh, like, what do I do now? What do I do now? I think the other thing which I think has been super useful is kind of, I've spent a lot of time over a number of years understanding or trying to get a sense of how journalism works and the sort of pressure that journalists are under. And I think that understanding that has been supremely helpful in terms of like there are like a few bits and pieces that certainly, like, UK and US journalists are under a huge amount of pressure. They probably have less than 20 minutes to write any given article. So if you're proposing, you know, to send them something and they can't write it up in 20 minutes, like, you're never getting covered. You are never getting coverage. So understanding that, I think, is super important, and sort of aligning yourself with their objectives. So thinking about how a journalist measured. Most journalists are still measured largely, the truth of the matter is, on page views and social shares, which are just page views, honestly. And they've got those targets to hit. So if you're creating content, you know, if you're focusing on figuring out what are the most resonant topics and what is most likely to get shared, you're really helping the journalist, like, hit their objectives, because they've got to write a certain number of articles and secure a certain number of page views. So you're really helping them. So I think that's certainly been useful over time, I guess. Yeah, maybe those things.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It was very wonderful experience for us, and thanks for sharing all the tips, all the information with us. I guess we will gonna have a break right now. I wish you were here in Istanbul.
Next time. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.